Okay, wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. I know it's late in the day, so I'll try to make this quick. So yes, my name is Nadia Seeteram. I'm a postdoc at the Columbia Climate School at Columbia University. But I'm going to be actually talking to you about my PhD research, which I did at Florida International University in Miami. So let's go there quickly. So Miami is a very interesting region at the southeastern tip of the Florida Peninsula. It is surrounded by water on all sides. You have the salt water in the Atlantic Ocean. On one side, you have the Florida Everglades, which is fresh water on the western side. And then it is built on very porous rock, which means water also comes up from underneath, which means that there is already quite a lot of flooding in Miami. And so these questions about, are we going to adapt in place? Is there going to be more in situ adaptation versus moving away are really, will have been ongoing for quite some time. At the same time, you also have these new sort of emerging impacts about climate gentrification. So where people are sort of actually moving to the higher points of elevation on the land. And what does that mean in terms of mobility as well? So we tried to capture these, emerging mobilities in this framework, which actually affects a lot of the dynamics that are seen in the aspiration capacity mobility framework that was presented earlier today. So it's a similar sort of concept. Really great to know that we are sort of capturing sort of similar, I guess, observation. But this framework sort of supposes that as your potential mobility outcomes are actually a function of increasing exposure to sea level rise and again sort of capacity that this can sort of measure through social vulnerability. So I'll just very briefly go through these. So we have communities that are relatively stable. So these are not communities of sort of no risk, but just sort of minimal risk. They have, again, sort of lower direct risk to sea level rise, and they have generally greater capacity to mitigate risk in any case. So then you have these migrating communities. They are, again, of higher capacity, but they are being directly impacted by sort of sea level rise impacts. And so when they sort of internalize this, they might actually sort of move out of their own, through their own resources or capacity. Then we have the displaced category, and that really reflects some of those more indirect impacts, where again, they are not actually being impacted directly by flooding, but because people, for example, in the migrating category or sort of resilience initiatives by the government might actually sort of put more sort of indirect sort of economic pressures sort of in their areas. Sort of send those pressures in their areas. And if there is actually nothing being done to sort of help them sort of withstand those pressures, they could be displaced as well. And then finally, we have these sort of trapped communities that are, again, more directly impacted by sea level rise and have fewer capacity to mitigate those risks. So we wanted to understand to what extent were these mobilities sort of emerging within the county or how they might sort of play out in the future. So we did about 40 in-depth interviews with residents across Miami and then about 600 online surveys to further contextualize these categories. So the first thing that I should note is we wanted to just ask people in general how, were you considering moving now or in the next 3 years? And I don't have enough time to get into the sample demographics for either the interviews or surveys, but I should say that in both the interviews and the surveys, the median time people spent or have lived in Miami was around 22 years. So it's not a particularly transient group of people, but around 47 or 40% of people in the surveys or interviews that they actually were considering leaving Miami within the next few years, about 35 to 38% said that they were not. When we asked them why they were thinking about moving, about 72% of people just mentioned affordability reasons, but these climate considerations in flooding and increased heat also came up. So in terms of alignment with the mobility framework, we actually found that through our interviews, people really were expressing sentiments and lived experience that did align with the categories. For example, this particular resident who was categorized into the stable category, he talked about when he moved to Miami, he was aware of the elevation problem and the floodings, and that's why he purchased the house that he purchased. With the respect to some of the residents who are categorized in the migrating communities, they mentioned very clearly the sort of financial implications of needing to move, that they needed to move because the values of their homes were going to drop, There are no risk disclosure laws in Florida. And so essentially, if they can offload that risk to somebody else, they would be very much really well wanting to. Now, the displaced category is one where people actually were not really responding to the sort of gentrification impacts that we thought they might. They were actually responding to still the direct impacts of flooding. So people said that, they could foresee themselves moving if they, if there was enough damage sustained to their home, and that was the only solution. And that was echoed as well by residents who were categorized in this sort of trapped category, but we did sort of expect to see that. So really, by and large, I would say, with the exception of the displaced kind of community, I feel like we did sort of capture, these concepts very well in the framework. Now, we did another experiment. We have these flood hazard maps that we created for this work. And so there were two different scenarios that were considered here. One, sort of a 100-year flooding event from 0 to 2 meters of sea level rise, and then the sort of slower onset of sea level rise inundation. And we gave it to our residents, and we asked them to locate their home on the map. And then we asked them, based on that level of flooding that you see, would you take no action? Would you adapt in place, or would you move away? And for the most part, in-situ adaptation was highly preferred across both flooding scenarios and all levels of sea level rise. But what you'll notice is that with the 100-year flood events, you'll see that the amount of people who said that they would take no action is a lot lower than those responding to the inundation scenarios. And that's because the inundation scenarios didn't really show that much flooding in those maps. And if you look at the extreme flooding scenarios as well, you can see marginally as sea level rise is increasing, the willingness to move is also moving up, and the willingness to adapt in place is moving down. So very interesting, very slight marginal impacts that we sort of noticed. So what was something that sort of contributed to that? Age is one of the big sort of factors. We did some chi-square analyses. People over the age of 65 were just not really willing to take any action, and it all sort of fits really well. I'd like to point to the confidence and ability to prepare for flooding. People who were not confident in their ability to prepare for flooding were more likely to choose move away as a response option. So just main takeaways very quickly. Sea level rise is reshaping mobility decisions right now. It's never, in my assessment is that, and I'm sure very consistent with all of your assessments, that it's not a primary factor, but it is there. It's present. It's reshaping those decisions, and it will continue to do so. Most residents prefer in-situ adaptation, even under high sea level rise scenarios, which just may not be sufficient for South Florida. I didn't mention this in the findings, but something that was really big that came out of both these interviews and surveys, that rainfall-related flooding is a driver of climate-related mobility. And I mention this because we just don't have the capacity to model it very well. We think about flooding and drivers in terms of 100-year flood events or long-term inundation, but it's also not clear to what extent it's being incorporated into adaptation planning. And finally, this idea of being trapped, we were able to further kind of contextualize it and realize that there are multiple ways in which people are being trapped. Of course, physically through floodwaters, but also because they don't have any affordable housing options to move out of, excessive damage to their homes, and then also in this sort of cycle of sort of asset and municipal devaluation. If that really sets in, then people really will be sort of financially trapped as well. And with that, I have actually quite a lot of collaborators that I'd like to acknowledge on this project. But any questions as well? Thank you.